A grain of salt, bit of tweak in the eye, bit of twinkle in the ear, because of course there's a lot of things missing, and this is not supposed to be like Stockstad or textbook. This is really a lot more sort of my interpretation, me having a little bit of fun too with art history and the timeline. So the way I did this collage is I was cutting out a lot of images from, well, art magazines and books that I happen to have and I didn't need anymore, lots of art books. But also I cut out stuff from, for example, here are some of my source materials. Life magazine, which I know some people, like, I'm not going to name the store, but there's at least one used book salesman who's not going to sell me any Life magazines anymore, because he once asked me what I'm buying the Life magazines for, and I told him I'm using them in my collages. And he said, no, I'm not going to sell you any. So I should have said, oh no, I make copies of them. But I don't want to make copies, because I like this idea of, well, first of all, there's amazing color in these magazines. The sizes are amazing, and I even like the texture. And that all will get lost if I make photocopies of them. So I don't keep these Live magazines for collecting. I think they would just collect dust. So I'm using them for collage material. Also, National Geographic is another magazine that had amazing images. So I would cut out all kinds of elements, and then I would put them in binders. This is my humans. See, remember Mitt Romney had a binder with women? I have a binder with humans. Okay, a binder full of humans. And so I just put the humans in here. I think at a certain point I might even have actually here I haven't categorized them, but in another folder I categorized technology. Technology, science, machines, transportation, that kind of thing. So right here it's just humans. So if I need a human of some kind, I look at this. Here's an interesting one from National Geographic. This is all the things a little Japanese girl owns. It's all very pink. And then here was all the things a little Japanese boy, could even be, this is the brother of this one. Anywho, all blue. So showing how gendered color is, or how culturally gendered color has become. So this is another binder. This is shape. This is actually one of my favorite binders, because this has, here's a bunch of plates, but it's almost difficult to tell they're plates. So this is something I could use in a collage if I need some sort of curvy, vertical element. Yeah, you see lots of shapes, things where you don't even recognize immediately what they are. And that's another thing with collage is you're of course taking things completely out of context. So a shape could become something very different within the collage. So these are examples of my source materials. And then here, this is, sometimes there's kind of like a collage in my binders, because here I put two guys together, and then I notice they kind of seem to be almost reacting to each other. So that's almost like a collage in itself. And then I have these, what we call them, drawing pads, where I have a lot of collage elements. Actually I want to show here. Here I was thinking about working on one with war. So here's only 2 images of war. And the idea was to sort of work on these and then incorporate them into the larger area. And then here, for example, I was playing with the idea of viewing art Here's somebody viewing art. Here's somebody looking at a glass room, which well, made out of mirrors, people reflecting, being reflected. All kinds of things. Here's another nice one with a woman looking at art. And a household. I also had a lot of themes. You see, and I see this here as this talk here as an opportunity also to point out things that I couldn't incorporate into my show. Because I had a lot of things just dealing with movements and particular periods and different cultures. And so I had a lot of things that were themes. Like here's the theme, household, or the idea of woman. Woman in the household, which of course, this idea kind of changed. But in the 50s, this was still a very big idea. So I found a lot of articles in Life magazines, photo spreads, showing women at work. Like here's an ergonomic study showing with light how women should be more efficient at doing household chores. And masses of people. And here I imagined, see here's people, they're praying, and I imagined, wow, how much laundry that would be. And so that's why I stuck this image of a woman next to a laundry machine. And Buddhism. It's also something I didn't use in the overall collage. People working in high-rises. And this I thought was kind of clever. Within the context of all these vertical elements here, this looks like a skyscraper, but it is actually a shelf with pills. This is the shelf with pills. And then I kind of imagined, well, it kind of looks like windows of a high-rise. Again, using photographs and doing different things with them. Okay, so the timeline, you really should look at this. And, oh, Dana created these little blurbs that talk about these various periods of art. Like here, prehistoric art. So you don't have language yet. You don't have written down history yet. So it's prehistory. And you have a lot of paintings. Here are the cave paintings in the cave of Chauvet. And I also liked here to put in the little dog and the children, who in 1940 found a very fascinating cave in the cave of Lascaux, which has great cave paintings. And there's the Altamira. And then there's a transition into the Mesopotamia, the land of two rivers, which is now what we call Iraq. So it's the Euphrates and the Tigris. And this is an area that is very fertile. And this is also where the story of the flood comes from. So I put here Noah and the ark. And lots of fields. And civilization starts here in the way we use civilization. In terms of a city, lots of groups of people living together in a small space. And laws. Here's the Stele of Hammurabi, which is considered one of the first law codes. The idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, comes from the Stele of Hammurabi. And the narrative, which is also in the Bible, the narrative of the Tower of Babel, comes from this area of the world. Where this one ruler wanted to build a tower all the way to the gods, to contact the gods. And then the tower fell apart really because the gods made all the people talk different languages, so they couldn't communicate anymore and they couldn't continue building the tower. And then here, transition into Egypt. And of course, something you notice with collage, I'm not using just images from Egypt. Here, for example, I'm using a burned up kangaroo from Australia. Australia always has really bad forest fires, and this just looked to me like it was mummified, and so that's why it reminded me of Egypt. Egypt, which is famous for its mummies. And so it shows you a little bit of importance of mummification, and here have sort of a mummy falling into a tomb, and of course tombs are very important. Art 160 students, can you tell me what is the purpose of tombs in Egyptian art? Why are there tombs? And why do people become mummified? Why are pharaohs mummified when they're placed in the tomb? Why just not leave them the way they are?
Preserve their body.
Aha! Why is it important to preserve their bodies?
They try to ensure their afterlife.
Well, yeah, because the idea is that their soul, the spirit, or the ka, wants to go back to their body. So they need a body for the ka to dwell in. And so the gooey stuff, like intestines, eyes, that stuff is put in jars. And here you can see some of the jars of the intestines. And in here, very smooth transition into Greece. And here, I wanted to include that too. There's a very famous pyramid at the Louvre, glass pyramid made by the architect E.M. Pye. And so this is not an actual Egyptian pyramid, but it's of course looking back to the Egyptians. And the Louvre has a lot of very important Egyptian works too. So here we're at the Greeks. And the Greeks are famous for putting a lot more emphasis on the human body. So in their sculpture, you see the way the human body stands. I even have a cartoon here that sort of makes fun of this idea that in Egyptian art, the figures seem very still. And in Greek art, there's a lot more dynamism and movement. And some of that, of course, has to do with the fact that for the Egyptians, these sculptures were meant not just to commemorate the particular people, but to serve as containers for the bodies. So they had to be something that could not break easily. And then here we have democracy, Athens, the first sort of democratic state where supposedly all people except women could vote. And here's Pericles, and I just noticed after putting this up, I have George Clooney here, and the reason I have George Clooney here is that he was in front of these famous statues that were in the Pan-Athenaic frieze. They are not in Athens anymore, they are in the British Museum, and the Greeks are annoyed, and the British, they're making the point that in the 18th century, Lord Elgin, a British person, bought these statues from the Turks. And the Turks were occupying Greece at the time. And the Turks were, yeah, we'll sell it to you, sure. And so now they're in the British Museum. And the Greeks are arguing, well, in the 18th century, the Turks weren't supposed to sell that stuff. It belongs to the Greeks, this stuff. But no, the British are arguing at the time, it wasn't Greek, the Turks were there, so there. So here's Clooney, and I think he was part of the team that wants the sculptures to go back to Greece. But then I noticed he's actually looking a lot like Pericles. And Pericles was a very famous individual. He was kind of like a celebrity at the time period. And Clooney is, of course, a celebrity. So there's an interesting connection right there. And, of course, Greece and Rome becomes a model for the United States in the 18th century. Here's a building, I think it's on Wall Street, and you have a police officer on top, I think watching over a demonstration at Wall Street. So here I have a lot of elements also from the United States. You even have, I think this is from Las Vegas, Gucci shop, very expensive bags and things to buy in here. And here I'm imagining, this is Venus of Milo coming out of the Gucci shop. And here are two guys who are checking her out. But of course, they're not two separate guys. They're the same guy, just from different points of view. You can play a lot with collage. And here's, of course, the famous group of Laocoon, who is a priest from Troy who gets in trouble, and snakes are sent to kill him and his family. Okay, and then we transition to Rome. And the Romans are very much influenced by the Greeks. So if you look at Greek statues, they look tremendously, you look at Roman statues, they look tremendously Greek. So you have the Roman Republic, and then you have the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire starts with Augustus. Augustus is the first emperor, and look at the statues that he has made of himself. Notice that he is presenting himself kind of like the Greeks. He's trying to present himself like Alexander the Great. And here is Alexander the Great defeating the Persian king Darius in Issos at a battle. And so the Emperor Augustus, he reigned for a long time, so he got really old. But all the public monuments would always show him young. So being young was very important for the Roman emperors. In the Roman Republic, they would show, and you see that also in Art 160 in Stuckstadt, they would show the wrinkles, because the Republican Romans, they thought the wrinkles showed you had experience and wisdom. But the emperors, the Roman emperors, they wanted to show themselves young, because that was the ideal, not to have wrinkles. And so I kind of made a comment on that by putting the head of Ken on here. What is Ken's relationship to Barbie? Are they friends? They're a couple? Divorced? Back together? I don't know. Okay, anyway. This is Ken, who has an interesting relationship to Barbie. And there are certain changes maybe each year, like sometimes he has an earring, sometimes not. But he's very idealized, always stays young. And that reminded me of the way Augustus I is always shown as young, never ages. Okay, and lots of Greek influence in Roman buildings, Roman frescoes. This is a fascinating statue. This is Marcus Aurelius. This is one of the only bronze statues from classical antiquity that was not melted down. Does anybody remember why was this not melted down? Yes.
They thought it was someone else?
Okay, who did they think it was? See, in the Middle Ages, they really needed bronze because they would use bronze to make useful things like weapons. But the reason why this object of art was not melted down is because they thought this was, see, in the Middle Ages, they thought this was Constantine. Constantine is an important emperor because he's the one that legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. And so the Christians really liked Constantine. So they thought this was Constantine, so they didn't melt him down, which is good. I mean, he still exists today. But it turns out this was actually a pagan Roman emperor. This was Marcus Aurelius. This was not Constantine. But good they didn't know. Otherwise, he would have been melted down. And then you have the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Byzantine era begins. And in the Byzantine era, you have a lot of use of mosaic, little pieces of stone. The churches become the cities of God in a sense. Churches are places where you're separate from everyday life. And so if it looks a little bit like jewelry going into a church, well, that's kind of the point. You're supposed to be in a different environment. You're supposed to be closer to God going into a Byzantine church. And so that's why it's also not that important to show people exactly what they look like. But what's important is their status in society. So here you have King Justinian, and he's shown as king because he's wearing purple and he's holding the bread that is used in the ritual of the Eucharist. And then there's also an image of his wife, Theodora, and she's bringing in, he's bringing in the bread, she's bringing in the wine that is also used in the Eucharist. Wine and bread. Okay, and then here we have the Middle Ages, Romanesque with round arches, and then the Gothic with the pointed arches. And of course the pointed arches. Oh. And also what was important about the Gothic cathedrals is they didn't have to use the walls to support. The walls were not used to support weight anymore because flying buttresses allowed the weight to be distributed outwards. So that means the walls could be made out of glass. So lots of glass in Gothic art. And Mary associated with roses, rose window associated with Mary, and a lady in her hula hoop. And this then leads to late medieval into Renaissance. And in the Renaissance you have the development of one-point perspective. Okay, can somebody tell me, what is one-point perspective, also known as linear perspective?
Yes. Taylor.
Okay, it's a way to show space. It's a way to convey three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional or onto a two-dimensional surface. It's an illusion. And it's a mathematical illusion. We see that here. It looks like there's a niche. This is Masaccio's Trinity. But actually, this is all an illusion. There is no niche. It's just a flat wall. But it looks as if there's a niche holding God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. That's the Trinity. And the donors are here too. And Adam on the bottom, my skeleton. Okay, and then I did things like here, the Florence Cathedral. I'm showing you the top, the lantern, but then I'm also showing you the lantern from another point of view, and then I'm showing you the interior of the Dome of Florence all at the same time. And then I'm also showing you Michelangelo's David, because this statue was supposedly done to be on one of the flying buttresses of the Florence Dome. But then the people liked this sculpture so much they wanted it lower to the ground, so it was placed in the main plaza of Florence. So it became a symbol of pride in Florence. And lots of linear perspective, for example, with Perugino's Christ giving the keys of heaven to St. Peter. And up here are images from the north, Northern Renaissance. You have here work by Dürer showing the four apostles, and Peter is actually not that important for the Northern Renaissance, for people like Dürer who believed in Martin Luther's Protestantism. So Protestantism does not put emphasis on communion, you know, this idea of the bread turning into the body of Christ and the wine turning into the blood of Christ during communion. That doesn't happen according to the Protestants. So Northern Europe is mostly Protestant in the 16th century, and that's shown with Dürer. And here, merchandising, merchants. And so I'm connecting here the modern day supermarket with a 15th century booth where things are being sold. And this is of course also a work of art itself. This is a photograph by, it dropped out of my hand. Whose work is this? Who's the photographer? Roots?
I don't remember.
Stutz? German dude with an interesting German name. And here's a wax figure by Juan Hansen that you see this sometimes in museums. This is a lady with a shopping cart who in a museum looks completely out of context, of course. And then here you have the Baroque. And the Baroque in Rome was very Catholic, trying See, this is after the Reformation has sort of split the church apart. The Catholic Church wants people to get back into the Catholic Church, and they do that by stunning people with art. And in the North, you have the same fascinating use of light and shadow, but the subject matter is a lot less religious and more dealing with scenes from everyday life. And in France, the Baroque is associated with Louis XIV. Here he is, Louis XIV, in one of his favorite fur jackets, or fur coats. And in Life magazine, I found this image of a dachshund, little dog, wearing fur, which to me is just, the dog's already wearing fur. Animals have fur. But this is a very rich lady, I think, who had put fur on her dog. So this is a dog wearing fur. And to me that reminded me of Louis XIV, who is also really rich and doesn't really need to wear that much fur. And then after Louis XIV, you have Louis XV, and you have the Rococo. And the Rococo is very different from the interesting proportions and symmetry that you have in the French Baroque. Rococo is all about, well, lots of F's. Frivolity, fluffiness, fumy, and pink. Lots of pink. So here are people having a really good time, lots of eating, cheese, cotton plantation, South. See, and of course I'm combining things that are from different cultures, different time periods, all to make a point. And this one I kind of like. I am connecting the frappe, the top of a frappe with its foam and goodness, with boom, an explosion that has a similar shape. And the pink X-ray is one that I like too. And then this kind of leads to a reaction, and the reaction is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, and also known as Age of Enlightenment, looks back to the Rococo and goes, oh my God, all this frivolity of rich people hanging around having a good time. Ugh. We should emphasize, we should push knowledge. And so, of course, the Enlightenment is also a movement less interested in the rich and more aimed at the middle class and lower middle class. It's all about learning and finding out how the world works. And there's lots of optimism here about how the world works. And once we know how the world will work, we will solve all the problems. And so that leads also to, see, there's Age of Reason and Neoclassicism happens at the same time. Pompeii and Herculaneum were two cities that in 79 CE were covered up by a volcano. Bad for them, but great for us, because in the 18th century, archaeologists discovered this and were able to dig up these amazing cities in great condition because they were in ashes, or they were covered up by ashes, so they were in very good condition. And so that led to an increasing, tremendous interest in the art of classicism. And the founding fathers in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, he also was tremendously interested in ideas from classical antiquity, ideas of democracy and such. And even George Washington here has a sculpture that looks a lot, has a portrait of himself that looks a lot like Seuss. Okay, and then here is a reaction to Neoclassicism, Age of Reason, and all that. This is Romanticism. Starts in the early 19th century, and Romanticism is very much emotional. Romanticism is almost the opposite of Age of Reason, Neoclassicism, because Romanticism says, wait a moment, rationality is only part of what we are. It's not our brain that really is important, it's our heart. So here I took an image from National Geographic with women looking at a heart in an exhibition. There's a heart way bigger than life size, and you can walk into the heart and see where all the veins are and stuff. And so the heart becomes important in Romanticism. And here I also have a lot of couples kissing. because that is, see, this is one of the ways I was able to take one of my themes, which was kissing and motherhood. I was able to incorporate that pretty beautifully into Romanticism, because Romanticism is very emotional. And you have horrible things happening. Here you have the French retaliating against the Spanish, because the Spanish in 1808 were upset that the French were invading Spain, and so they demonstrated and revolted, and in return the French shot a lot of these Spaniards. And so this is a symbol of atrocity, a symbol of bad things humans do to each other. And this is all part of Romanticism. Romanticism is dealing with the darker side of humanity, and that includes the French killing the Spaniards. And landscape. This is something that's very important for the 19th century for Romanticism. Looking at the landscape, looking at our relationship to nature, and how small we are, and how sublime and huge nature is. And then it becomes out of sequence a little bit, because here's the Garden of Earthly Lights, and that's a piece in itself from the Northern Renaissance, 1510 to 1515, done by Hieronymus Bosch, with paradise on the left. In the center you have all these human souls, too much interested in love activities, and that leads to hell. And so this is a moral piece, at least the original work has a morality to it, because the idea is that all these souls that are interested in love, earthly desires, that leads to hell. So here the souls are in hell. And of course what I'm doing with my piece is, I'm showing hell that already exists. You know, corporations making way too much money, buildings on fire, global warming leading to horrible disasters like flooding, what have you, nuclear explosions, Chernobyl, and then of course the Japanese one, all kinds of horrible things. Ronald McDonald, forcing young people to eat horrible things. And in the original work of art, you have sort of the idea of Bosch is that he wants to show hell as something where everything is turned around. So you have a rabbit hunting a hunter. And so I turned it around by showing a dog with a saw in his mouth, chopping off the head of his owner. So this is not something that should happen in everyday life, but in hell it does. So this is my hell panel. And in here the chronology connects again. After Romanticism, we have something called Realism. And here is a work called The Stonebreakers and Burial at Ronan. So these are two works by Courbet, and I play off of those by showing all of these different things from Life magazine, National Geographic, and other places to show work, hard work. Here, for example, is a young child in an African nation having to work in a mine, and here's a guy with a gun. Obvious what's going on here, and this guy's probably not even getting paid for what he's doing. He's forced, this is forced labor, under gunpoint, and so horrible conditions. And funerals, connecting with burial at Ornans. And then we have Manet, lunching on the grass, Impressionism, lots of dancing. And so I have a dancing figure by Rodin next to Swedish soccer player, which to me, you know, she's like dancing. She's dancing with the ball and then scores. And then here I have Edward Monk's The Scream, and these red lines can actually not see it because it's covered up. But this is actually a swimmer in a pool that has red reflected in it. So this is actually water. And again, collage, I'm using elements in a very different context, so they become something different. In the early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th, people were very fascinated with other cultures. Gauguin, for example, was an artist who went to Tahiti and really idealized these other cultures because he thought, hey, in Europe, everything's becoming very urbanized. But over in these other countries, on these islands, in Tahiti, for example, all they have to do is lift their hands up and they can take oranges from the tree. And of course, this is idealizing these cultures. And so you have a lot of these idealized cultures being shown by 19th century artists. Here's from a film, I think this is Anthony Quinn, a film about Paul Gauguin, showing him painting one of these natives. And there's Keith Haring, a work from the 1980s. He was also sort of looking back to different cultures, and of course, Cubism. Picasso is looking back at these two faces that look just like African masks. See, a lot of modern artists were purposely not looking back to classical antiquity. They were purposely looking back to different cultures. And then some artistic groups were looking to the future. They were looking for technology, or they were looking at technology. The futurists, for example, they said that a speeding car is more beautiful than the Victoria Samothrace. And here you have the Victoria Samothrace. It's a sculpture from over there. It's a sculpture from the Hellenistic period, late Greek. And here I have her, the Victoria Samothrace, being run over by a car with a happy lady waving some sort of scarf. And the idea here, of course, is that this is the futurist idea of a car being more beautiful than classical Greek art. And the futurists, they really have a bad name now because the futurists became so fascinated with war, and especially the First World War, 1914 to 1918, they were involved in it. And that war was seen as not very positive, especially afterwards. So then there's the Dada movement starting in 1916 that looks at technology in very much a negative way. Here are automatons. See, this is George Gross making fun of this idea of machines, saying, look, we have become machines. Here's a machine waving a German flag, connecting patriotism with mindlessness of robots. And you have German expressionism here, the Blue Riders, blue horses, which are at the Walker. The Walker owns blue horses. So using color for spiritual purposes, not for representational purposes. And here's a very famous work by Picasso. This was hanging in the Museum of Modern Art until the 1980s, when it was decided that Spain had become a democracy, because that was what Picasso had said in his last will and testament, that this work should be at MoMA in New York until Spain has turned into a democracy, then it can be sent back to Spain. So after Picasso's death, in the early 80s, it was sent back to Spain because it was determined that Spain had become a democracy. But this shows a horrible thing from 1937. It shows the Germans bombing, well, basically Franco with help of the Germans, bombing this northern Spanish city of Guernica. And here you have photographs, documents of it, and a famous painting by Picasso showing this horrible event. Okay, and then I have abstract expressionism. And the reason I'm connecting it with Guernica is that Jackson Pollock in New York saw this painting, Guernica. He could, if he wanted to, see it every day because he was living in New York. This work was in New York. And this gave him the idea of creating a big paintings, mural-sized paintings. And that's really what he does with these strip paintings that he's famous for, also known as action painting. And he's literally part of the painting, and he's painting this huge, these drips, and it's really not about representing anything, it's about the act of painting. This is why I think action painting is such a good term for it. And then there's a reaction to action painting, and the reaction is pop art. And in the 1960s, the pop artists say, well, what is all this action painting that doesn't seem to relate to mass culture? Let's bring mass culture back into the scene. So you have silk screens based on photographs of traffic accidents and things like that, but also based on photographs of celebrities, famous people. And then you have here a lot of modern and contemporary art. Installation art is covered. Here's Oldenburg, also part of pop art. He's someone who did the famous Cherry Spoon Bridge, which is at the Walker Art Center. Okay, any questions?
I'm sure people do have questions. Curt will be here for a little bit too. But feel free to kind of walk around a little bit longer or talk to Curt. But thank you so much to Curt for giving us a little bit of insight and everyone for coming.
We said keep it airing. I was real curious.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming again. Stick around as long as you want. Ask Curt questions.
Yeah, but this-
Questions over here.